Salisbury is being transformed in ways that no one ever imagined, say, a century ago. When we started this conversation, we were talking about what Salisbury looked like in the 19th century, and we've seen there's been a huge transformation taking place with that.
Salisbury, like many other places, was affected greatly by the Great Depression.
Salisbury probably was a little less adversely affected than, say, some larger urban communities because you had an agricultural base here and people could return a bit to their roots. Whereas I think of some of the larger cities, say Philadelphia, so forth, they would be much harder hit for that. But indeed, there were people who suffered here. We don't have good indicators of how badly it was, but we certainly know that things were not the best of times.
During the Second World War, Salisbury relied on POWs in nearby camps for labor.
Salisbury did have a couple of canneries, and many of the POWs, whether they were housed in places like Westover Camp, south of Princess Anne, or other camps on the Eastern Shore, they could be transported. I have not heard that they were living in Salisbury, but they may well have been used in the canneries at Salisbury, particularly since there was a shortage of manpower.
Some of these POWs returned, some just to visit and some to live, but all with happy memories.
For them, what was interesting, according to tales that they themselves told, they were better off being POWs in America than they were in the German army. The overall revival of the U.S. economy, I think, took care of most employment challenges that people had. There, as I say, could have been tensions that existed between some, and that would have been probably at a much more personal level than at a generalized level. I'm not aware of any organized criticisms that was made, for example, of those German POWs who chose to come back here and resettle, and that's partly because I don't think their numbers were that great to have made a visible difference in the community.
There may have been some personal biases, especially from the maltreated black community.
Where the prisoners were taken to, like, the movie theater. African Americans would find that extremely ironic that the prisoners were allowed to sit in the regular seating, whereas the African Americans had to sit in the balconies. So.
The coming of the Route 50 bypass coincided with the destructive and often discriminatory practice of urban renewal.
Urban renewal, in terms of the 1950s and 60s, meant tearing down of buildings and areas under the excuse for highways. It usually coincided with the highway movement, which is like Route 50. You're talking about. They expected that people would stop and shop in Salisbury because it coincided with a whole lot of urban renewal, removing of properties and building parking lots near downtown. So it seemed as if they were expecting that the highway would bring a lot of business to Salisbury. That did not happen because people going through were on their way to the resorts. So it was really a byway. You go through Salisbury to get to the resorts. And you could see that happened. All the new parking lots, taking down of buildings to build parking lots, and creating more stores downtown.
They decimated neighborhoods, neighborhoods that the people in charge thought were slums at the time, and slum clearance, blight clearance, urban renewal were the terms of the day. And so it was excused as, hey, this is cleaning up a city, to carve through it with a highway. But what a highway does is not only does it, what an urban highway does is not only does it decimate the neighborhood that is no longer there, but it also divides.
Part of Salisbury called Georgetown. It was an African-American neighborhood in Salisbury called Georgetown that was basically eliminated through urban renewal. And I was told that term by a late historian who lived through that, and he referred to getting rid of that neighborhood through urban renewal.
Well, that Route 50 went through in the 1950s. And now, of course, we've moved to the modern bypass, even more on the outside of the city.
The bypass that we had built, these lighted highways through the city, that's not enough. We have to get out and go around it with a limited access freeway. And let me tell you, what that did is that just sucked more dollars out of our community.
So where that original Route 50 went through, there was still a little bit of commerce on the other side, but all of that was taken away, concentrating all of the commercial development onto Main Street itself. But prior to that time, there was something called the Wacomico Garage. It was right next to St. Peter's Church. There were a lot of other structures and buildings that were there that were just taken away when the highway came through.
Like many cities throughout the United States, Salisbury built a shopping mall to attract commerce. This effort was enabled by urban renewal and undermined by the construction of a bypass.
This mall is hurting. You only have to walk through it. You can see the number of closures that have taken place. Sears was the most recent one.
A move towards drug use followed, especially prevalent in the counterculture era of the 60s.
You could argue that some of the expansion of drugs goes back to the 1960s, when you had people such as, let's call it the baby boomers coming online, if you will, and looking at marijuana and other drugs as just recreational experiences. It was compounded when you had veterans who had been under stress in Vietnam, for example, coming back, and they were more prone to taking drugs, particularly as they had difficult times adjusting to limited job opportunities and discrimination when they came back here as civilians. So we already had our initial wave, if you will, of drug abuse and drug addiction back in that time period, but it accelerated in more recent years with a lot of these so-called recreational drugs and people not having any idea of how lethal they could actually become.
You're talking about 1,800 Part 1 crimes. Part 1 is everything from, theft, stealing a candy bar, all the way to homicide. You got to look at, why is that happening? Why is that happening? Is it connected to the opioid crisis? Perhaps. Theft from motor vehicles is our second highest crime, so shoplifting and then theft from motor vehicles. So I think, you got to connect it to the opioid crisis.
Combined, drugs and the bypass created harder living conditions and dealt a good deal of damage to Salisbury's economy. This led to an exodus of jobs.
Wayne Pump was the company that was coming out of Wayne, Indiana. That's where we have the name Wayne Pump. And for years they were making these gasoline pumps, but there were some elements of labor strife, I think, in Salisbury. And this had to do with efforts to organize workers at then Dresser Industries. The same thing was true of Crown Cork and Seal, which was in Princess Anne. And the negotiations broke down, and eventually the owners of those enterprises chose to move elsewhere. So there was a big loss of jobs as a result of those firms closing down. But for a while, Salisbury could lay claim to being somewhere on the map because they were making them. I remember traveling through the Congo in the 1960s, and I remember seeing a gasoline pump surrounded by weeds, and it said Wayne Pump.
The one industry that remained with Salisbury from the Depression to the modern era has been the poultry industry.
Poultry raising is very compatible with a lot of the farming that we have for other purposes. And, the Purdue family has been around since 1920, but they're not the only ones. There used to be a family called Esham that were well known. Then you have Mount Ayr and a bunch of others that have come to this community. As long as you have an agricultural region here, I think it has a certain appeal for poultry raising and poultry farming. We're not the only place where poultry is raised. It's just this is one of the characteristics of this region. It still is a draw. Salisbury is one of the major metropolitan areas in this whole peninsula. It will continue to do so. I think the phrase that you see on the billboards that says, "Welcome to Salisbury, crossroads of Delmarva," is very well said. It's the east-west crossway for Route 50 and the north-south crossroads for people coming up and down Route 13.